Chapter 3. Ophelia had only seen the stairs and the hallway leading to her room before she was thrust back into the giant mansion and being summoned to the dining hall for dinner. Daphne didn't change her dress, convinced it was still appropriate for a small gathering, and the two followed Tanis across the house to a large chamber on the second floor. It was lit with the same crystal chandeliers, and around a redwood table were white cushioned chairs. The table was set with crystal wine glasses and white china plates lined in gold. The floors were white tile, which reflected light throughout the room and made the place much brighter than the rest of the house. Ophelia peered through her veil at the other feeders, who all stood along the walls. Ophelia counted 5 of them. The beautiful young man and the voluptuous woman from the viewing earlier that night stood opposite her with their caretakers. Charlotte's young man was close by, standing like a statue. There was one other feeder to Ophelia's left, a small young girl by the shape of her body. A parade of servants filed into the room, all dressed in black, and began setting out food on the table. Red grapes, a platter of steamed duck with the head attached, mixed red potatoes and spices. It all smelled absolutely divine. Ophelia couldn't remember the last time she had a hearty meal of that sort, and breathed it all in, imagining the taste as best she could. It made her stomach growl. Daphne elbowed her softly, but Ophelia couldn't help her body's reactions to the pristinely cooked meal. Finally, the lords walked into the room. Ophelia counted 4 of them. Raphael and Charlotte waltzed in, arm in arm. They'd both changed their clothes since last Ophelia saw them. Now Charlotte was dressed in a golden yellow gown with diamond trim, and Raphael was fitted with another suit, this time in a jewel-tone purple. They made their way to the 2 seats in front of their feeders. Behind them came a tall, slender lord wearing a Gothic Victorian-style 3-piece suit in wine red. Long raven hair hung over his shoulders, but was tied halfway up and pulled tightly from his face. He was white as snow, his eyes a honey gold with dark frames and small animal pupils. The dark-haired lord had to be Maddox. Ophelia had seen him in the media, though in person he was a much more dominating presence. On his arm was a lanky, slender woman in a revealing red gown that opened up to the middle of her thighs. Deep tan skin glowed in the gold light, and long ringlets of chocolate hair hung down covering her bare back. Courtesans wore red in such styles, and were treated more or less like queens. Their skills in the bedroom and their ability to please the lords was not something any average woman could possess. She commanded the room almost as much as the lords themselves. Once all the lords took their seats, the last member of the party entered the dining hall, straight-faced and with an almost bored gait. Kieran, the pale-haired vampire that brought Ophelia to the mansion. His hair was loose of its bun now and cascaded over his shoulders. He'd removed his jacket and wore only a white shirt and a black vest now, but his figure was just as enchanting, if not more so, without the blazer to cover him. Ophelia stared, through her veil, watching him glide into the room and take a seat opposite the others, his back facing her.
"Gentlemen,"
Maddox spoke in an effortless, deep voice.
"It's been a while."
Raphael and Charlotte, like 2 children high on sugar, giggled in his direction.
"What brings you to our neck of the woods, Mad?"
Raphael asked.
"Just passing through,"
he said, raising his hand toward the young feeder beside me. Her caretaker, a short, middle-aged man in a brown suit, walked her gently to Maddox's side, lifting a gold bracelet off her wrist to reveal days' worth of punctures at different stages of healing. Her caretaker had a small thimble on his thumb equipped with a metal stinger, which he pierced into the girl's skin, drawing blood. The lords continued to converse as the girl's blood drained into Maddox's wine glass, filling it halfway before the caretaker returned her to her place by the wall. Ophelia knew how it all worked. She'd even attended events where feeders were present with their lords. Such a private dinner felt different, though. It felt heavy and daunting. She locked her fingers together in front of her, meditating on the fact that she'd trained for such things. She was aware of her duty, her purpose. She stood there chanting it to herself as the lords ate their dinner. Kieran, Ophelia noticed, rarely opened his mouth, and when he did, it was to answer a direct question. Engaging in the conversation of his own free will didn't seem to be important to him, and instead he just listened and slowly ate the small portion of food he was served. After an hour or so, the servants brought out a course of dessert and cleared the table of any dinner items. One by one, chocolate cakes were served, topped with spirals of orange zest that filled the room with cocoa and citrus aromas. It was then that Raphael and Charlotte both summoned their feeders and filled their glasses to the brim with blood from each of them. Charlotte paid no attention to her feeder as the caretaker bled him into her cup, but Raphael chose to do the deed himself. He continued talking casually to Maddox as he did, cutting the woman's wrist with his meat knife. She barely winced, a sign of good training. With her vein opened up enough to fill his cup completely in just a few seconds, he let out a light bout of laughter, as if amused by the sight. Once his cup was filled, he tossed the woman's wrist aside carelessly, dripping red on the tablecloth. The woman's caretaker quickly attended to the sloppy wound, wrapping it in gauze, which most caretakers kept on hand for such incidents. She stopped the bleeding swiftly, not making a scene, and the two returned to their place, remaining silent. Ophelia shook a little at the thought of a serrated knife slicing into her like that, and then quickly got a hold of herself. If she even breathed wrong, Daphne would have her head.
"You've stained the tablecloth,"
Maddox pointed out as Raphael licked some remaining blood off his fingers.
"No matter,"
Raphael shrugged.
"They'll replace it by morning."
"Who?"
"The servants, of course." "Well,"
Maddox chuckled,
"keep in mind you're living here as a favor to your father. Everything in this manor is old and valuable."
His smile flattened, his eyes piercing right through Raphael.
"Respect it. It's not even yours."
"I do," Raphael laughed, lifting his hands in surrender.
"But we are what we are. There's blood everywhere in this manor. Can't you smell it? A good cleaning can't get it out of the floors." "You're testing me, Raphael,"
Maddox sighed, taking a sip of blood from his glass. His eyes lifted toward Kieran, who hadn't spoken for some time.
"Kieran,"
he said,
"you haven't even taken a sip of your feeder. Are you unwell?"
Kieran tapped his fingers lightly on the table.
"Just tired,"
he said.
"Perhaps because you need a drink,"
Raphael said, sliding his tongue across his fangs. Kieran didn't answer. He just flashed a smirk in Raphael's direction and shifted subtly in his chair.
"Raphael is a foolish brat, but he's right,"
Maddox said.
"You just got your feeder today. Feed from it. You'll feel better."
"She's nervous," Kieran said. Ophelia's breath turned to ice in her lungs. She could only see the back of his head, but his words made her blood stop.
"She?"
Raphael snorted. He leaned toward Charlotte with a laugh.
"He called it a she."
Charlotte laughed with him, their shoulders bumping playfully together.
"Quiet, Raphael,"
Maddox said, exasperated.
"Me? He's the one being a prude." "He's also 100 years your senior." "A century is a small difference when we're immortal," Raphael said, his eyes flashing bright blue. "I was born. He was turned. Isn't there some etiquette here that isn't being honored?" "A century is a large difference when you're just a child, and you, Raph, are a child. Born or turned, it makes no difference."
Offended, Raphael chugged the last of the blood in his glass and wiped a hand over his hair, shaking his head.
"You know,"
Raphael said,
"showing favoritism to Kieran Frost because he's a little older than me is an irritating concept."
He stood from his chair, jaw clenched. Charlotte, who'd been giggles and smirks since Ophelia saw her, leaned away from Raphael, watching him closely.
"My father never stood for disrespect like this." "Because your father earned my respect,"
Maddox said.
"You have yet to do that." "Then why visit, Maddox? Why come here? To talk down to me? Simply to visit my best friend's sons. Sons? Kieran is no son. I'm Vitali Blood. What was he? A poor farmer my father took pity on? There's no need to explain it to him again, Kieran sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. You're taunting me, Raphael said. This is my house. It is your father's. In his absence, it's Kieran's. You know this. It's mine. My father hasn't returned to this side of the world in 50 years. I'm a lord now, just like you. Hardly. A lord does not shout his material desires like an infant for his bottle. Your mocking remarks will hurt you someday. Raphael's tone sent chills down Ophelia's spine. She squeezed her hands together, watching his face grow more feral by the second. Kieran sat calmly, unfazed by the outburst. Maddox also sat quietly, as if the tantrum was not worth his time. As the servants filed back into the room to collect dishes, Ophelia felt her lungs tightening with anxiety. These chairs are mine, Raphael said. This house is mine, not yours. His attention turned to Kieran. You should not even be here. Referring to your feeder as a woman. It's not a woman, it's a thing. You both are from another time, but this is now, he snarled, pressing his finger down on the table. Sit down, Raph, Maddox said, rolling his eyes. I don't have to listen to you, Maddox. This is my home and Kieran is the one renting space. He pointed. All this is mine, to do with what I please. It is not. Not yet. You're all fools. Ophelia gulped when Raphael's eyes scanned the room looking for something to make a statement with. His focus settled on the man from the viewing earlier that night. He moved his fingers in a beckoning fashion, and the man approached. Looking Maddox in the eyes, he jeered. I'm a creature of desire, he said. Raphael, Maddox said warningly. Raphael growled, swiftly raising his steak knife and driving it through the feeder's neck. Kieran finally stood from his seat, leaning forward on his fists. Raph! He barked. When Raphael slid the knife free, the feeder's blood spewed out onto the table. Raphael grabbed the man by the back of the neck, forcing him over another wine glass. The blood filled it to the brim, and then overflowed over the dishes, drenching his hands. All the while, Raphael watched, his lip curling into a pleased smile, as if he was getting off on the sight. Ophelia stared unblinkingly as the feeder realized that he was about to die. His body started to convulse, and he grunted with panic. But a grunt was all he could muster. Raphael kept draining him while Maddox and Kieran hissed with disappointment. Raphael tossed both of them a challenging grin before squeezing the back of the feeder's neck so hard the vertebrae snapped. The sound could be heard through the whole room. His body jolted, and then went limp. Raphael threw back his head, licking his lips with a pleased groan, while the feeder's body flopped onto the table and rolled to the floor. Red stains painted the tablecloth, and the cuff of Raphael's suit. Aside from Kieran standing on the other side of the table from Raphael, no one moved or spoke or reacted to the dead man and the savage way he'd been butchered. Ophelia still couldn't see Kieran's face, but his posture was rigid. He slowly straightened himself off the table as Raphael wiped his red lips with the other cuff of his jacket. These feeders are mine, he said. Behind him, the servants stood silently in a line, heads toward the floor. He glanced their way, motioning to the mess with a lazy hand. Clean this up, he said. Raphael slumped back into his seat, relaxed and spent. Even Charlotte looked a little put off, and sat stiffly with her legs crossed and her hands in her lap. Well, Maddox said. Point taken, though not the point I think you were trying to make. The disappointment in Maddox's movements was so apparent it was like the word was written on his forehead. He stood up from his seat, straightening his vest. His beautiful courtesan followed, pursing her full rouged lips. Many courtesans were on some kind of calming drugs, and by her indifference, Ophelia suspected hers were doing a very good job of keeping her calm. Maddox avoided looking at Raphael and moved his gaze toward Kieran. Until next time,
he said, inclining his head. Meanwhile, Raphael was waving his hand at Maddox as if shooing out a pest. Kieran bowed his head at Maddox in return and watched as he, the lady in red, and the small feeder exited the dining room. When they were gone, a claustrophobic silence filled the room. Ophelia felt her heart getting ready to break her ribs and burst from her chest. She could almost smell the metallic scent of blood in the air. The servants gathered to quickly clear the man off the floor. His limp body was like that of a doll. Blood sloppily smeared across his neck from Raphael's violent assault.
Your father would be ashamed of this behavior,
Kieran said flatly.
Then he should come back and tell me himself, shouldn't he?
Raphael hissed, a smirk making his mouth crooked.
But he refuses. And if you think for one moment that you have any authority over me, you're mistaken. You're no family of mine, as much as Daddy likes to say so.
Ophelia kept staring at the floor, where the red stain seemed to be the only color her eyes could see. Against the white tile, it was like a bright light in the dark. Her breath was quivering in and out of her lungs.
Anyways, Raphael sighed, standing. I'm quite full for the night.
His eyes flicked toward Ophelia for less than a second, and Kieran subtly shifted his weight to block his view. Raphael huffed as if about to laugh, escorting Charlotte out of the room. They didn't even bother stepping over the blood. Charlotte's dress dragged through it, and the two combined left a trail of footprints and red smears as they exited. Kieran remained standing, collected and thinking as the servants continued to tidy the room.
Miss Compton,
Kieran finally said, half glancing over his shoulder at her.
Take her to her room,
he said.
Calm her down. Her incessant breathing is irritating me.
Kieran marched out of the room, and after a few seconds Daphne grabbed Ophelia by the arm and began tugging her along through the manor. Ophelia could barely keep track of where they were, but when they came to her chamber, she stumbled inside, clutching her chest. "Shh!" Daphne hushed, leaving again and closing the door behind her. Once alone, Ophelia ripped the veil from her face so she could breathe and slumped onto the edge of the bed. All she could see was that boy being drained dry. There was no warning. Feeders were supposed to be treated well. Agreements with the feeding agencies were supposed to ensure their well-being, and contracts said he'd have to pay a hefty fee to the agency for the loss of one of their assets. Feeders were rentals, in a way, and now one was dead. Falling over onto the bed, Ophelia curled herself up tight and closed her eyes. She took long breaths in and breathed out slow, just like she'd always been taught. Once more, the real deal was far more devastating than anything she'd been trained for. Death was always looming, and now it was breathing down her neck. The thought gave her immediate needle-like chills. She couldn't get rid of them, but soon enough she fell to sleep with that cold reality planted inside her.